I'm bringing up my good friend Gaurav, and much like this morning's conversation with the lock note in the morning, we're going to have an evening conversation. So the idea here is we're going to sit down, have some beers, have a
Fireside
conversation.
chat.
It's Tiger, of course, in case you're wondering. There is no other beer in Singapore but Tiger. And we're going to talk about regulation. We're going to talk about innovation, sort of the tensions between regulation and innovation, the private sector and government entities. And hopefully what you'll learn is kind of a perspective coming the view from government. And hopefully I'll provide a little bit about the perspective from civil society. And then we'll hopefully have a little bit more clarity around the situation. So we're going to kick it off first. Let Gaurav, who's a former Deputy Chief Executive of the Cybersecurity Agency of Singapore, and before that in the Air Force, just talk a little bit about where you're coming from so they can understand.
Sure.
And then we can welcome you to your sabbatical.
So first of all, cheers, everyone. I apologize for being incredibly selfish and the two of us having the only beers in the room. but hopefully the conversation will be more entertaining as a result of that. But cheers, firstly.
Yep, cheers.
Thanks for having me.
Good to see you.
So let me start by giving people a bit of context about me. So I spent 20 plus years of my life in the Air Force, and in the last part of the Air Force tour, I did two roles which were completely contradictory. So I was the CIO, driving digitalization and innovation in the Air Force, and I was also the guy in charge of network security, which is kind of the whole cybersecurity plus the NOC as well, which put me in this very difficult position. On one hand, I have to push innovation. On the other hand, I have to kind of regulate myself and kind of put boundaries of where I can go.
Digest the innovation.
Yeah, no, so it was a very tricky role to manage. And in one of those cruel kind of life twists and punishment, I complained so much about my own cybersecurity regulations that they eventually threw me out of the Air Force and put me into the cybersecurity agency, where I was then responsible for coming up with many of the regulations at the national level.
Well, wasn't there some sort of North Korea tie-in to your career development?
Yeah, it's kind of the last one or two events that I was part of the security team for was the Trump-Kim summit, which was held in Singapore. And if you think about guarding the security of that summit, yes, there's a whole bunch of physical security things that you have to do, but the North Koreans also do a whole bunch of other stuff. And I'll leave it at that. But whether I did well or didn't do well, I'm not quite sure. But either way, I was thrown out of the military and put into the cybersecurity agency, where I spent 4 years atoning for my sins. And just kind of thinking about that trade-off between how do I create a safer country online through regulations, through innovation, through industry, all of those things. And I was there for 4 years. Just this May, decided to take a quick break, and I'm on my 3-month sabbatical. So I am an unemployed former Deputy Chief Executive, and that's why I'm having beer on stage. I'm pretty sure if I was still a government officer, this would be the end of my career there.
That's right. And now you'll hopefully get to see it through the lens of maybe a commercial entity or consulting or something, but you'll see it again. The whole problem sites will look totally different from a different angle, I guarantee it. So it's interesting, though, you mentioned the role of government. The role of government in regulation, the government's not a business.
Yeah.
Right? Despite how enterprisey Singapore is, it is not a business. Governments are not businesses. They're there to do things businesses cannot do. So, what is the sort of social contract of government in fulfilling these roles?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, because what is the objective of a government? It's to manage a society, it's to manage a country. And essentially you've got different dilemmas and different trade-offs from a company, bigger sometimes, but both times different. Regulation is one of the tools that a government has. And thinking about why you regulate is actually an important philosophical question. One of the things that Singapore thinks about when it thinks about cybersecurity differently from other countries is we think of cybersecurity as a public good, not a private good. Fundamentally, we believe that everybody has the right to feel secure online. And yes, it's like tap water. Everybody deserves to not die when they drink tap water. But if you like beer, if you like bottled water, you can go ahead and buy private sector solutions that are better quality, that are more to your taste. But that starting point changes how we think about the responsibility and the role of government. Regulation then becomes a tool that we use to achieve that particular goal. Now, why you regulate is largely because you think that there's a necessity for it. Actually, despite being from the government, I didn't particularly enjoy the regulatory part of my job because it's the last thing that you want to do. You hate to be the guy who sets the rules. Even though I spent 20 years of my life in the military, I'm very good at following rules. I don't actually like rules. They're the last resort that you call on if everything else has failed.
So I'll tell you a quick story about in the States, and you tell me if it's sort of the same trajectory in Singapore. So in the early days, we thought that informed consumers would make good product choices, and then manufacturers would increase the security of their products because, hey, that's what people are buying, right?
Sounds sensible.
And based on the Volvo model, right? Volvo was a very safe car. They pioneered many safety innovations. They had a great reputation for being safe. So you wanted a safe car for your family, you bought a Volvo. Unfortunately, manufacturers had these software shrink wrap licenses that prevented us from publishing security findings. It prevented people like Consumer Reports from publishing reviews of the software. Oh, that sucks. Okay, but the insurance industry, they'll force the issue because they'll tell companies use the software that causes less problems. The companies will buy the products. The companies will get the manufacturers will get bigger. Then the consumers will follow the products that they use at work, and it'll be great. And then insurance didn't quite ever. There's a little resurgence in insurance now, but it never quite happened. So that leaves us with only one tool left in the toolbox, and that's regulation. And that, in my view, as a private sector guy, that's a two-edged sword, right? You could have good regulation. You can have bad regulation, but I've come to terms with the fact that we're going to have regulation because the other two options, the less invasive options, have sort of failed.
And it's fascinating because it is completely sensible, and especially for most of us in the cybersecurity industry, it's completely sensible that shouldn't you want better security as a customer? Shouldn't you want better security as a company? Shouldn't all of this drive a natural behavior towards increasing safety and security online? Strangely enough, that's not what we saw. And for the last kind of 20, 30 years of digitization, we have not seen that ability to self-regulate at the level that we wanted it to be at for a safer online society. And malicious actors are running rampage. So you're right. We ended up in this situation because we thought all of the other options would work, and they didn't.
Right.
And so kind of governments come in, and you're spot on. When governments come in, sometimes it's good.
Yeah.
And sometimes not so good.
Right. And so so I'm wondering if there's like a little bit of nuance there, right? What happens if you get invited in, right? Like, so sometimes an industry will say, like Facebook did this for a while, like, oh, we're okay to regulation. But they only do that once they get to a certain market size, and they're using it as a barrier to entry, right, to other competitors. And so how would you evaluate, how do you think about this? We're going to regulate. We've never regulated before. It's almost like an environmental impact study. What's the harm? Not malicious harm, just there's costs involved. And so who's going to bear the costs?
So yeah, if you step back and trace through the kind of history of the big tech industry kind of growing and the specific carve-outs that were made for them regulatorily. So we have not regulated the tech industry in a significant way. Antitrust aside, the actual kind of safety, security standards of tech have not been regulated in the same way every other industry has been regulated.
Right.
Aviation, automotive industry, all the rest of all.
No, the only other industry that's not regulated besides software, I think, is religion.
Possibly. I as as a cybersecurity professional, I'm well out of my depth to comment on that. But no, I mean, and unregulated industries are weird. How do you evolve and grow in a responsible direction with the absence of any boundaries? And so technology's had this free play for a long time. Now, you've got these huge companies that have grown as a result. And when these huge companies now say like, hey, you're welcome to come and regulate me, the challenge for countries that are, we'll put America aside for a minute, a country like Singapore, I mean, we're relatively sophisticated, relatively advanced in our thinking. How am I going to regulate big tech? I mean, big tech is bigger than Singapore. Big tech is bigger than many of the countries.
Right, the sales in your country is a rounding error.
Oh,
yeah.
My GDP is a rounding error to some of these companies.
Right.
And you think about the scale of power that they have. Yes, they're inviting you to come in and regulate, but the conversation is not one of even equals. It's clearly there's a difference in dynamic. And the second complexity to it is, yeah, I can regulate them in this direction, but how do I know every other country in the world is going to regulate in the same way? And then when you have that divergence in regulatory frameworks, that creates problems not just for the company, but also for the countries, because you put them in a difficult position, you put yourself in a difficult position. You have to justify now to your citizens and to the companies why you're doing it, this way instead of that way. And that's a whole complex conversation that really is very problematic to manage.
And one of the things when I think about it is there's this class of problems, social dilemmas. In the social dilemma class of problems, there's one tragedy, the commons. There's another one that people like to refer to a lot, the free rider problem. There's a number of them. But it seems like government, one of the roles of government is to uniquely address these problems, or problems where companies are so fantastic at externalizing their costs and risks. And a lot of times government's left picking up the costs and the risks, right? Like remember all those e-bicycles that were in Singapore?
Oh, wow.
Everybody's business model was these bicycle rideshare.
There are graveyards where there's all of these bicycles.
Thousands, thousands. And at one point in Singapore, they said, okay, but you have a responsibility to pick up the bicycles. And the bicycle companies did the math and said, we can't afford to pick up the bicycles. So they fled the country and left thousands of bicycles behind, right? So you make a little change, right? Hey, why don't you do the responsible thing and clean up the bicycles? And sometimes that will scare away a whole business.
So, but that's an interesting and actually a great segue into thinking about how you regulate. So we decide to regulate because there's either a market failure or there's significant externalities, there's harms that the industry itself doesn't have to internalize. It's common across every industry, so pollution is another great example. But then how do you regulate? In the bicycle example, one of the things that we realized was we had no issues with the idea of renting bikes. Having bicycles going on the streets, there are some issues. We just wanted to manage the outcome of, or the risk of people having these abandoned bikes left to rot, kind of cluttering up the pavements and the sidewalks, and just told them, look, you can go ahead with your business model, but this is the risk that we want to avoid. And that risk is abandoned bicycles, broken bicycles scattered all over the city. And then they did the math and they were like, well, we can't help you with that, and they left. When you start thinking about regulatory interventions, my own philosophy, and this is kind of me saying this as an unemployed person, is that you should always think about regulating for the outcomes that you want to achieve or the risks you're trying to avoid. Never try to regulate prescriptively. So don't tell people specifically this tool needs to behave in this specific way. Tell people the outcome I want to achieve is clean pavements, and the risk I'm trying to avoid is pavements littered with broken bicycle parts.
Right, it's the perform network scanning, not use Nessus.
Exactly. So tell people what you want to get to or what you want to avoid, but don't tell people how to get there, particularly in tech, because it's so fast moving. And generally the people who know most about tech aren't always in government. They're the people who are building this stuff. So try not to be prescriptive. This is actually harder than it sounds, because making interventions that are specific and prescriptive, both are easy. It's easier to do because you're targeting a particular tool, and it's also very populist. And there are plenty of examples, countries that have responded to ChatGPT by banning them, countries that have responded to apps by banning them.
Well, I can imagine that you might have some pressure where vendors are like, yeah, mandate our tool. We have a great tool. Use our scanning tool, right? And all of a sudden, they want you to start picking winners and losers in the marketplace. And you're like, oh, that's not the role of government, is it?
Yeah. No, picking winners and losers is one set of problems which absolutely, you're right, it creates this other weird dynamic that you shouldn't get to. But the more interesting one is trying to ban an implementation of a concept of technology is futile.
Right.
So we'll take
no large language models.
Yeah. No, so it's not even that. People are saying like no ChatGPT. ChatGPT is one implementation of a large language model, of which there are open source, there's 100 different, you can spin up your own. So banning ChatGPT is a prescriptive intervention, which doesn't address the outcome or the risk you're trying to avoid. But it's populist, it's easy to do, and you can just pick on it.
Right. No. So I think that the one you referred to is what I'm calling sort of app diplomacy, where India and China having some disagreements, and so India says, okay, well, no TikTok in India. Sorry, remove it from the App Store. And TikTok says, that cost us $6 billion. And China says, okay, we'll retaliate. We'll remove the Indian. Oh, we don't allow any Indian apps in our app stores in China. So it's like an asymmetric response, right? And so it's very frustrating to China because they don't have an equivalent tool, but it's become another diplomatic tool. So now all of a sudden, people around the world are watching us, and the countries are like, oh, banning apps is a new diplomatic tool.
Yeah. And then you're going away from the cybersecurity conversation into a more geopolitical conversation, which, I mean, countries are having those geopolitical conversations around cybersecurity, but it's not because of the tech anymore.
Right.
The specific risks of TikTok to teenage girls, there are social issues there. I'm not sure they're specifically cybersecurity related, nor are they unique to TikTok as compared to all of the other social media apps, which I'm very unfamiliar with, but it's just one implementation of a broader problem.
Right, and so instead of addressing the underlying problem, right, they're grasping on these specific.
And that's not a great way to do regulation because, in my view, it creates an environment of regulatory unpredictability. It's sudden, it's abrupt, it's oddly specific, and as a company, you then have no certainty that you won't be the next target. So now we come back to that idea of innovation and regulation. What would companies like? Well, they would like to be in an environment where there's regulatory predictability. Even if the regulations are not always in their favor, at least you know that it is on a path of predictability. There's some sensibility to it. These are people who are thinking about outcomes and risks, not specific, scapegoats. And then they're also thinking about informed regulations. And that's a huge part of the conversation, which is talking to the people that you're going to regulate. If you just suddenly announce through dictate that you're going to regulate XYZ technology without having any consultation, firstly, there's a high chance you've gotten it wrong because the experts are not in the room, they're usually outside. Second, and civil society is another great example of people you should be consulting. But secondly, if you are a type of country that announces regulation with no prior consultation, that doesn't give the innovators chance or any certainty that they're going to be, allowed to explore boundaries.
To do their thing. Yeah, and so I think one of the things you brought up, though, is, gosh, we got a couple good topics to talk about now. Okay, one, I'll start with this one, rule of law, because you talked about regulation and certainty. And so I would say that's sort of related to rule of law, but maybe the efficiency of rule of law, the predictability of rule of law. And since we're in Singapore, I believe one of the unique superpowers of Singapore is rule of law. And I think that's one of the reasons why the country has flourished so well and why so many headquarters and tech innovation and intellectual property and financial is in Singapore, because it is reliable, it's predictable, right? Geographically located, a lot of cable, undersea cables, but why are they here? Why aren't they next door? And so that is a competitive advantage, right? Like that predictability, there's value there.
Absolutely.
Do you think the regulators realize that, though? Or is this an accidental competitive advantage, or is this an intentional, like?
I don't think that, I say we, but I guess
used to be me.
Yeah. They. I don't think they think of it as an action to gain a competitive advantage. Really, the driving thought is what needs to be done to protect society from the harms online. And if you look at how we think about just evolving our regulation, which is also a great conversation, the way we introduce legislation after consultation, the way we iterate them. So the Cybersecurity Act in Singapore is like 5 years old, and we already announced last year that we're going to review it. Why? Because it's 5 years outdated.
Are you going to call it like 1.1 or 2.1?
So internally we call it 2.0. And internally we have like a 2.1 plan, 2.2 plan, 2.3 plan. And we do this, so even our the Cybersecurity Code of Practice, which is the kind of specific outcomes that we expect essential services to keep themselves up to, that's actually called 2.0.
I was really, for the United States, I was really trying to get the White House to have the national strategy for cyberspace 1.0, 1.2. By just putting the numbers after it suggests that you can iterate and you can improve.
Absolutely. And having it as a 1.0, the 0.0 actually is important because it means that you can make small changes along the way. If it's just 1, then to get to 2, it's a huge leap.
That's a big lift.
Yeah, it's a big lift. I mean, developers know that you like the 0.0001 change and just kind of push those small updates. And actually, legislation for tech should be that way. You should have the ability to make small iterative changes in legislation to adapt to the changing circumstances without having to overhaul the entire legal infrastructure. And so you'll see that some of the things that we pushed in kind of the last couple, they have pushed in the last couple of kind of months even. Yeah, I know. every time I call myself I should, yeah. No, but like there's the Online Criminal Harms Act, there's the Broadcasting Act, there's the Fake News, the POFMA Act, which got a lot of flack. But my sense is, because these are not stagnating, they're constantly being reviewed, it's fine. We don't believe in kind of fire and forget laws, where you push it out, thank you, you push it out, and then your job here is done. Technology is forever protected by the one law that we introduced 18 years ago,
That's right.
and it's okay. But there are countries that think about it that way. It's like, my
gosh.
job is to have one regulation and we're done.
There's a wiretap act in the United States from like 86, right? Email, everything has to be wedged into this one law.
Yeah.
It's so frustrating. They should just update that. And so, okay, you have your 1.0, but do you think there's some value in like sunsetting, or saying every 5 years you have to review this, or saying it's indexed to inflation, or it's indexed to number of school children, whatever it is, right?
Absolutely.
You put some controls in there to say, or do you just say 1.0 and hope somebody down the road comes up with a 1.1? Or do you say, like what you're doing, every 5 years, you say, every 5 years this act shall be reviewed?
I mean, so one option is to just time bound it. So you say every X years this has to be reviewed. I think that is a functional approach to the issue. You just kind of force in the algorithm that there's a time-bound kind of review cycle. An ideal approach is actually a needs-based review. So you keep looking at how technology is evolving. And there'll be times when 5 years is too long.
Yeah.
If you've sat around for 5 years, and my sense is that for AI, these next 5 years are going to be absolutely critical. If we sit around for 5 years and wait, I think we'll be in a very different world by then. And so time-bound is one option. But actually, needs-based is another one.
Yeah.
Keep watching, keep listening, keep learning, and adapting your legislation to it. And I guess the question that they are thinking about is, are these almost?
That's a good one.
Are the harms that are being caused by emerging technology new enough to be uncovered, not covered by existing criminal legislation? So we'll take deepfakes. Are deepfakes a new type of crime? Or are they an existing
Or is it a
crime?
crime?
Is it even a crime? Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, so one of the things that we had these interesting debates about is it illegal to do bad things to a completely fake avatar? No human was harmed. There's no actual individual involved. You're not defaming an actual human being by misrepresenting them. It's a fake. It's an artificially generated people, and we're seeing pictures of these all over the internet.
Right.
Is it a crime to do bad things to them? I don't know. But we'll have these discussions. We'll have these debates. We'll understand what the industry is saying.
So this is that point about, I think we talked about earlier, which is, with technology, are you basically creating new ways for people to commit old crimes, right? Like right now with cryptocurrencies or Web3 or NFTs, whatever you want to call it, it's like people rediscovered confidence scams.
Yeah.
Sham, stand-in, straw men. It's like, everything that was a scam in the 30s and 40s is new again. It was the golden age of old fraudsters, right? Or does technology create a brand new kind of crime that we are like, ooh, new thought crime, whatever, precognition, whatever. Or is it really, no, it's turtles all the way down. It's old crime all the way down, just with a new paint.
Yeah. No, I mean, there are some that are traditional crimes just done at a scale, scope, and speed that have never been seen before.
Right.
And to some extent, it's not that the law can't keep up, it's that enforcement can't keep up, because it's at machine level now. It's hard to keep up with that pace of crime. And some part of it, just the world is a really weird place now. In my previous role, I remember having to discuss with some elderly gentleman who was really angry about losing money on a crypto scam. And he said that he spent money on this thing called the cat coin. And he was angry that the cat coin was a scam when the Doge coin was real. He's like, how come my friend made money off this dog coin and I lost money off this cat coin? It's like, why is that the case? It's like, bro, I wish I could understand why a
Cat
crypto-
coin failed and dog coin is.
Catcoin wasn't even real. CryptoKitty is real. Catcoin wasn't. Dogecoin is real. It's like, why? It's like, I don't know. It's just, it's a weird world we live in when you can't actually tell the difference between what is a legitimate investment instrument and what is a complete like meme that is just meant to be a meme and completely doesn't exist. But that's the space that we're in now and trying to figure out how to regulate and enforce that. It's tricky.
So yeah, I'm going to go with almost everything is an old crime reinvented.
Okay.
And I think that's partially because that's how criminals think, right? They're like, this is a new opportunity to apply this previous thing I knew or know. I don't know how many are masterminds thinking up a new business law. And business logic crime is still business logic crime. It's just, maybe done in a slightly different way.
Yeah.
So while you're cooking up your regulation, I'm assuming, people are essentially people, just criminals. They, do you then look around, like what is the innovation laboratory for regulation? Like, it's like, oh, well, we're a small country, Israel's a small country, we'll see what they do, they'll see what we do. Do we go to Switzerland? Or is it more like, no, we'll look at the whole marketplace of regulation and pick and choose what we think might work?
Yeah. No, so there's a couple of levels of conversation. So at the United Nations, there's this grand conversation about what states should be doing. How do you use your ICT infrastructure in a responsible way? And so there's a whole United Nations conversation, which, at this point in time, Singapore happens to be the chairperson of. And we're trying to figure out, what does it mean when you are a responsible user of your ICT infrastructure? What does it mean when you're irresponsible? So we're sharing best practices at the UN level. But then you come to specific laws. And increasingly what we're seeing is that countries are engaging each other a lot more, sometimes bilaterally behind closed doors, sometimes multilaterally in open forums, trying to understand, how do we deal with IoT? And there's plenty of platforms, plenty of multilateral sessions and events where we discuss, this is how Singapore is approaching IoT security. This is how Germany is approaching IoT security. It's how US and UK are approaching it. And it's all slightly different. We've chosen to go with a labeling scheme. Some of them are going to go with slightly different schemes. But we're discussing it. And we're learning what works for our population, what doesn't work for our population, and we're sharing that. And I think over time, as we share those notes, we'll get to best practice over time.
Yeah, and I think the labeling is a great example because it was debated in the United States for a long time, and then Singapore did it. And what was the European country that also did it?
Germany, Finland.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that gave the states enough confidence.
It wasn't a terrible idea.
Not a terrible, well, because, the scale is a little bit different, right?
Absolutely.
And so I think there is maybe this sort of laboratory of innovation around regulation.
Yeah. And so I think there is an opportunity for regulation or for governments to use the tools that they have at their disposal to spur innovation. So the labeling scheme is a great example where we have...
Explain it for people who might not be...
So in Singapore, we have this thing called the cybersecurity labeling scheme. If you buy a router at a traditional kind of brick and mortar shop, it's going to have a 1, 2, 3, or 4-star sticker on the side of it. And the logic behind it is that the consumer who doesn't really need to know anything more about cybersecurity is just going to see that, oh, this router is 4 stars and this one is 1 star. This costs $1 extra. I'm just going to pay $1 extra for the 4-star one because it's probably better.
More stars, good.
Yeah, more stars is better. And the behavioral insight that we received from our team was that people pay for this thing called premium orange juice without having any idea what was premium about the orange juice. They just always buy premium orange juice. And today you can go to the supermarket and see there's all these premium orange juice, and it looks exactly the same as the non-premium orange juice, except the label's different. But people all pay for that label. And so the insight was, if we can put a label to bring the cybersecurity of the thing out, people pay a bit more for a baby camera, for a router, for whatever it is. That was the theory.
And you're not trying to increase the cost, but you're trying to provide an incentive for consumers to select it, and then therefore the manufacturer...
Yes. So going back to the starting point of this conversation, wouldn't it be great if consumers on their own demanded for better security?
Right.
And that's what we're hoping happens. Obviously, Singapore on our own as a market is just tiny. It's not going to move. But once we started it and we had enough data and we started talking to other people, we're like, hey, we've done it. It's kind of working. People are happy about it. People think that we're being responsible.
You're like doing the Git commit on the open source that everybody else is going to run.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. We're like the first. We're like, I've tried out my local host. It doesn't work. It's stable. I don't know if you deploy it to your X million users, it might not be. But for my 1,000 user base, it seems to work. Let's see when you spin it up what happens. And so that's the kind of approach that we take towards iterative kind of slightly innovative solutions to cybersecurity threats at the national level.
Okay, so kind of tangentially related is carve-outs for research, carve-outs for the freedom to sort of tinker, the freedom to test security on maybe critical systems that are important and not go to jail, right? And so I think we've seen governments over time, we have bug bounties now, which are sort of a safety valve. We have coordinated vulnerability disclosure, so people can share it. There's code camps and hackathons, and in the United States there was a famous Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which was really brutal. It really prevented a lot of research, and then they made a mid-course correction and they added exemptions for medical devices, election security equipment, a couple, I think aviation, life safety type systems. And that unleashed a torrent of not just innovation, research, which led to innovation, led to new businesses around testing medical devices. So you might also not have to regulate, you might just create an exemption, right?
So on both levels, so I'll take medical devices, that's a great example. So for medical devices, actually, we've talked to the industry and we've talked to our healthcare, kind of the ministry.
Excellent.
And the same logic that applied for the labeling scheme works for medical devices as well. If you're going to get a pacemaker implanted, you would love to have one where the wireless signal is not kind of unencrypted and easily hacked from 100 meters away. You'd love to have one which has some cybersecurity baked in. If you have any embedded device which cannot be easily removed except through surgery, you want it to be somewhat secure. And they realized that there was no standard or no impetus for the industry to do it. So we start with the labeling scheme. We see if that works with medical devices. But trying to do that through just kind of brute force regulation wouldn't have worked. The carve-out now actually...
It's kind of like the inverse, right?
Yeah, the inverse. Yeah. For the carve-out model, we realized that for either big companies that operate systems or manufacturers of these big systems, it's not their incentive to work with small security researchers. What we've ended up trying to do is that if you're a government service or if you're an essential service that's operating in Singapore, you must have a vulnerability, we call it a vulnerability disclosure program. You must have one. And that immediately puts the onus on the organization to be willing to work with security researchers who flag up like, hey, I'm a university student. I found this thing. It may or may not be true, but can I discuss this with you? You now have an obligation to at least discuss this with them.
Right. And if they don't, they'll go talk to CSA or whoever the regulator is, or Ministry of Health.
And because we have that, they come to talk to CSA. I'm just going to point to myself again, but they go and talk to CSA because that conversation is one that we're inviting. The security researchers need to feel safe and confident that they are not the bad guys. They are helping the good guys defend ourselves better against actual bad guys. This sounds intuitive to everybody in this room, but there are many countries that still have legislation that specifically target security researchers. And sometimes it's lobbied by big industry. Sometimes it's just they forgot it. They designed it in the 90s and left it in there.
Oh, I mean, so having done DEF CON now for coming up on 31 years and 27 years of Black Hat or so, the number of times that industry has intimidated and threatened researchers and we've had to cancel talks, I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah.
And soon as vulnerability disclosure programs, soon as other alternatives, the researchers are like, fine, I'm dumping it on full disclosure. Fine, I have alternative ways. It's legal for me to do this. Sorry, you can't intimidate me, right? Once those options came out, the number of intimidations against researchers come way down. And so part of it is, does your society allow for this kind of expression of research? And that's why we're talking about the carve-outs.
But the carve-outs are just they're a specific implementation of a mental model.
It's like it's like a prerequisite. If you don't have it, you can't have like the next step, right?
Agreed. But again, it's a specific implementation of a mental model where you have to start treating cybersecurity professionals and security researchers as part of your extended arm, you're part of your extended team, and not the guy that's trying to take down your
Not
company.
the adversary.
Not the adversary.
Yeah.
So the same thing with red teaming. You don't treat red teaming as an adversarial thing. It's a training tool for your own blue teams.
Right. Yeah, so okay, I'm going to shift the conversation just a little bit. So now you have these carve-outs. Now you have this regulation. You've gone down. You've done some labeling. You've got these acts. Now it's time to get graded, right? How do you think about like a feedback loop? How do you get feedback to decide how to improve your 1.1, right?
Yeah.
Because if you don't have a feedback loop, you're kind of in the blind.
Yeah.
And feedback loops on regulation I sound scary.
It's not scary. It's just notoriously difficult to do well. If you get feedback from particularly big companies, they've got machinery in place to make sure that the feedback they give you is persuading you to move in a particular direction, which is favorable to them.
But so the feedback loop on bicycles they flee the country and you have 1 million bicycles on the streets.
Yeah.
That's not a very good feedback loop.
That's a fair point. That is a fair point. But you have to have, so industry consultation is important, but you have to also recognize that the industry consultation will give you a particular type of feedback.
Right.
The other type of feedback that you need is going back to your policy intent. Have you achieved the outcome of a more secure society? And then you balance it off. So industry doesn't like it, but hey, actually my citizens feel more secure online.
Citizens like,
all right, let's balance this off. And you look at the scams that happened, the banking scams that happened in Singapore where people were sending people phishing links by SMS. We forced everybody to do sender ID registration. Yes, it increased cost of sending SMS. Yes, it was a little bit of a hassle for everybody. But now people feel a little bit more secure online, a little bit. And so we've achieved the policy outcomes. Yes, industry feedback is like, well, this was a pain to implement, but you've achieved an outcome. And so you have to balance that off. But you have to get that feedback and iterate constantly.
So I think we were going to talk a little bit. We're running almost out. We got about 2.5 minutes left. I just want to touch a little bit more on innovation because we've done a lot on regulation. So how much of innovation is trying to sort of attract the shiny new tech, whether it's crypto, blockchain, something, and hope for that to spur another sort of round of innovation? And how much is continuing to feed and tend the garden of previous sort of innovation? Like how do you...
Yeah, no, so this is the investor's dilemma almost. The shiny new toys are exciting, but they take time to mature. OpenAI didn't start in November. They started for years and years before they had ChatGPT available to the public. There's two parts to it. One is, as a general ecosystem, you want to encourage people to push kind of cutting edge ideas and build those tools in Singapore that you want to change the cybersecurity industry, and that you want to have that ecosystem available to them. But you also want to create enough difficult problems that inspire innovation. And some of those difficult problems can be solved with things that already are built. Some of them will require new things to be built. And what's interesting is that if you as a country can put together a set of problem statements that are significantly challenging, actually you end up attracting really smart people to come and try.
What's an example?
Oh boy.
I mean, Singapore was known for a while for trying to innovate in blockchain and having the courage. So for those of you who don't know, Singapore did something really interesting with blockchain when it was fairly early. This is 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah, 4 or 5 years ago.
Where the government basically gave a certain amount of money. I forget how much it was, $1 million to every government agency and said, you have a year. Does blockchain do anything for you? And a year later, they wrote these reports and they were trying to figure out where the value of blockchain. Like, I don't know of any other country that so intentionally tried to figure out.
So, I mean, yeah, we do try to have some intentionality behind the innovation. We also sandbox some of it. So, like, all right, we're going to try this out. So we have for some of the cash grants that we give out, we actually use our own kind of currency. It's a digital currency.
We do that.
Yeah. I'm going to need more beer. But yeah, so these ideas are parts of kind of a wider attempt at trying to push innovation in the cybersecurity industry, or at least in the tech space.
Yeah, but I don't think who else would just say, try blockchain across 20 different things, right? I mean, that is really unique. And then you see that again with kind of cryptocurrencies for a while.
Yep.
It kind of turned into the bicycle dilemma that you had here a little bit. You talk about that.
Attracting some bad investments as well. AI as well. They're going to try that out. Quantum as well. Surprisingly, Singapore does relatively well globally in terms of quantum. And
that's through your university systems, right? Or is that through an...
University system is one, but there's a whole wider ecosystem of technology investments and talent that have come in to look at quantum, both communications and computing in Singapore. And we actually have quite a number of bright minds looking at this in Singapore, despite relatively small market. So, I mean, these are different ways of thinking about that regulatory framework around innovation. And I guess kind of we're way over time, but as a parting thought, like one of the biggest problems I had when I was in the Air Force trying to drive innovation and digitalization was a prevailing mental model that cybersecurity was here to say no and to tell you that technology is bad and risky. And I hated that prevailing mental model. So when I came into the role, I told my team, look, I can fire everybody here and just keep repeating the message that technology is risky, technology is bad. I don't need to hire good engineers to tell me that technology is risky and technology is bad. What I'm paying all of my great engineers to do is to tell me, how do I de-risk the adoption of this amazing emerging technology? And so the mission of our team was to de-risk the adoption of emerging technology. Like, yeah, I get it. AI is risky. Blockchain is risky. How do we de-risk it? How do we help companies use it safely and securely? IoT is risky. How do we design what became a labeling system to help companies buy IoT more safely and more securely? How do I help patients embed a pacemaker in their body with confidence that this thing was built safely and securely? I get it's all risky. Let's de-risk it for them.
So my, even though we're out of time, but my goal is to get Gaurav to finally make a final mistake and drink the last of his beer. So I think we're going to talk a little bit more, if I can get you to make a mistake. But I want you to talk a little bit now about the innovation, finally, and on an innovation note, you, outside of government, you're heavily involved in trying to create sort of social good through technology. And maybe talk a little bit about what you're doing there to inspire some people, and talk about how that has interacted with or without government regulation that's allowed you to do this.
Yeah, so outside of my previous role in CSA, I ran Tech for Good organizations, a charity that was called Better.sg, and we basically digitized other nonprofits, and we helped build kind of innovative solutions to tackle social good problems. Tech for Good exists in many countries. It was kind of slow to catch up in Singapore, so we kickstarted it. The interface...
Is that a failure of government?
No, not
So
at all.
Tech for Good is fulfilling a gap in government services, or?
It fills the boundary, or the space between where public, private, and individual responsibility sometimes lie. So government, I'll give you one specific example. We built an AI ML system, this was like 3 years ago, that helped an individual key in the challenges that they had. So, I have one leg, I have diabetes, I have low income, please help me, I need to pay my bills. You type that in, and we would trawl through all of the terms and conditions of government grants, charity sector grants, religious organization grants, and based on what you've keyed in, all of the terms and conditions were like, you should apply for these 3 in this order.
Oh, fantastic.
So that's not a failure of government. Government has the schemes available,
right?
But
it's an accessibility issue.
It's an accessibility, and the private sector has some of these schemes available, and the charity sector has some of these schemes available. But how do you put them all together and design it for the individual? Government's not responsible to build a search engine for private sector schemes. Private sector is not responsible to build a search engine for government schemes.
Right.
And that's that gap in between all of the 3 that, just build a small, simple tool.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed our conversation with Gaurav, and I hope to see you next year. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, guys.